Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Recovery Talk. This is actually my first episode recording in 2022 because the other episodes were pre-recorded from December. I have been spending some time abroad in Spain to see family, and I literally just got back to the UK. It was so nice to have a bit of a break. And most of my plants survived as well. I mean, 2 or 3 of them died, but they were already hanging on for dear life, about to die. So that is good news. For those of you who don't know, I am obsessed with plants and I have a ridiculous amount of them. Anyways, guys, let's get into today's topic. Today, I wanted to talk about metabolism and metabolic healing. This is one of my favorite topics. And I know I say that about so many topics to the point where it's like, yeah, but is everything your favorite? But it is one topic that I find absolutely fascinating. And it is also a topic that I work very extensively with my clients. So when I start working with the clients, sometimes they will be metabolically suppressed, so their metabolism will be very, very slow. And part of the work that I do with them is working on healing their metabolism. And part of why I find this so rewarding is that it's one of those things when I start working with someone, people don't think it's possible until it happens. It is a little bit like, breaking the binge restrict cycle or binge purge cycle, or reaching someone's set point weight. These things, when you are in depths of an eating disorder, these things seem impossible, right? And the same thing goes with metabolic healing, because the unicorn syndrome tends to latch on. And the unicorn syndrome, I've spoken about the unicorn syndrome quite a few times. It's essentially the belief that you are uniquely flawed and different from others, and that the normal rules of recovery does not apply to you. So this unicorn syndrome tends to latch on for people struggling with, suppressed metabolism due to restriction, right? And the unicorn syndrome will tell you, actually, your metabolism is permanently broken and there's no hope for you, and you need to just keep restricting for the rest of your life. And a big red flag that it is actually the unicorn syndrome speaking is that the answer to the problem that the unicorn syndrome tells you about is more restriction, and a sign that you can't recover. Because essentially what the unicorn syndrome is, it is something that keeps you stuck. It is argumentation for why you cannot recover. And it is just so rewarding to see people experiencing something that they thought was not really possible for them, but they gave it, they took a leap of faith and they made the jump, even though they were like, okay, well, I don't think this is going to work, but Amalia, I'll trust you. Let's try this. And then they realized, oh my God, my metabolism was not permanently broken. And I also come from this with not just, my work and my, studies and all of that. I also come at this with personal experience. During my eating disorder, my metabolism was so badly suppressed. I remember there was a period during my eating disorder where I was still very much in the depths of the eating disorder, but I was like, I can try and eat maybe like a little bit more, right? So I increased my intake just a tiny bit, still ridiculously low amounts, but I increased it just a little bit, just to see, And I ended up gaining weight. And I was just like, why am I gaining weight eating an amount that most people would drop a ton of weight from eating, right? Literally eating dieting amounts and I'm gaining weight. This was the first confirmation in my head that, my metabolism is permanently broken now. And it just confirmed this idea that my eating disorder had put in my head, that recovery was not for me. I am broken. I'm the unicorn. It might work for other people, but I need to restrict for the rest of my life. And the second time that I essentially got evidence in my head, evidence that my metabolism is broken, was when I actually started recovery. This was a while after my period of just slightly increasing my intake, but still being very, very, very disordered. And so essentially I started recovery, and I was speaking to a dietitian at the point, was working with a dietitian, and the dietitian essentially, we agreed on just like a rough calorie goal just to, get started. And we started very, very low. The reason why we started very, very low was simply just to rule out the risk of refeeding syndrome, right? When you are very, very undernourished, gradually increasing can help reduce the risk of refeeding syndrome. So refeeding syndrome is essentially a metabolic disturbance that happens or can happen in someone who is increasing their intake after a period of undernourishment. It is rare, but it is quite dangerous if it happens. So when I work with clients, that's very often why I would tend to refer them to also see a dietitian that can help them navigate this risk and help increase slow and steady. If you are not in the risk of refeeding syndrome, there is not really any reason why you have to increase super slowly. This is a question I get a lot. I get asked a lot, like, oh, well, I'm not in risk of refeeding syndrome, but should I increase slowly then? And it's like, no, there's not really any reason why you have to increase slowly unless you are in the risk of refeeding syndrome, right? But very often the eating disorder will want you to increase as slowly as possible because that feels safe and comfortable, right? Anyhow, back to the story. Okay, so it was 2013. I am entering the room to see a dietitian and I am petrified because at that point I had essentially kind of agreed that, let's try this recovery thing. I'll try it, but I was kind of like halfway in, halfway out. I was not fully committed at all. So we started at a very, very low amount for reasons explained previously. I was in the risk group of refeeding syndrome. I usually don't mention calories, but I will mention it in this podcast just to show you how suppressed my metabolism was. If calories is very triggering for you, maybe skip the next 10 seconds. Dietitian started me on something like 1,200 calories, but I did eat quite a lot less than that because I was so scared. Probably ate like 1,000 calories, even less than 1,000 calories. In other words, a very, very low amount. And also keep in mind that people with eating disorders, we have a tendency to overestimate calories, right? So we think we eat 1,000 calories, but we eat 800 calories, right? Very, very common behavior. We round up the numbers instead of rounding them down. So if it's like, oh yeah, this is 94 calories, let's make that 100. No, let's make it 120, because maybe it was a bigger serving without me realizing. Let's be on the safe side, right? And this is also why when some people are like, why am I not recovering? What is going on? I'm eating so much. I'm like, are you really though? Are you really? Are you sure? Another reason why a dietitian can be helpful, and even a meal plan can be helpful in some cases, just for that accountability part. Anyhow, so we are agreeing on this ridiculously low intake just to get me started. And in 1 week, no, actually less than a week, I think it was 5 days, I gained 5 kilos. That is just over 10 pounds, 11 pounds, 12 pounds. And of course, that confirmed my worst nightmare. My metabolism is broken. I need to restrict forever. If not, I'm going to keep gaining this amount every week for the rest of my life. Except that's not what happened. First of all, let's talk a little bit about that rapid weight gain that I experienced. It is important to be aware that a lot of the early weight gain that people experience, and I will talk more about this in another episode, a lot of the early weight gain that people experience in early recovery that is very rapid, sometimes seemingly overnight, a lot of that is actually water retention. So your body is starved and it's like a sponge just holding on to water. And there's just a lot of confusion going on for your body, like metabolically, because there's more food coming in and it may react by holding more water. And of course, also very common is with eating disorders is that your digestive system really slows down. So when you eat food, it stays in your stomach and system for longer. So this is a lot of the early rapid weight gain. That's the first thing I want to say. But it is also true that in early recovery, weight gain, that is, actual body fat, does tend to happen a bit quicker because you are starved and because your body is desperate to hold on to everything it gets because it has been detecting that there is a famine going on and we need to save up for the next famine. Doesn't it make perfect sense? If you're completely broke, you're probably going to try and be a bit more mindful about spending money, rather than if you suddenly won like $1 million in the lottery. And it is at this freak out moment where so many people go wrong and do the exact opposite of the solution. In this moment, I could have panicked and decided recovery is not for me, my metabolism is broken, I cannot increase my intake, I should actually decrease it or just maintain at this ridiculously low amount. But I didn't do that. I did the other thing. I went in the other direction. I went in the recovery direction. And this is actually the start of Let's Recover. I was very confused about what was happening, so I started researching human metabolism. And I started learning about things like, starvation mode, how our bodies respond to undernourishment, metabolic repair. I started learning about these things. And that's also kind of how Let's Recover gets started, because I started sharing these things with other people. Like, hey, you don't have to worry. So have you seen this study? I started sharing it and kind of translating the studies into easier to understand metaphors, right? So I took a leap of faith, despite the fact that my eating disorder was screaming at me. I cannot emphasize this enough. When I took that leap of faith, it was not because I felt like, oh yeah, of course my metabolism is going to heal. No. My eating disorder made me feel like 100% like your metabolism is broken, right? So I had to do what felt very, very wrong and just have some faith in, science and the articles I read and the experiences I read from other people. I just had to, take a leap of faith, basically. There was no, oh, now I feel ready. Now I get it. Now I'll just do it. No. There was nothing like that. I was shit scared. I promise you. Oh my God, I was so scared. So what I did with my dietitian and my psychologist at the time, we actually started increasing my meal plan. Yep, I was gaining weight on next to nothing. And we were increasing my meal plan. Slowly but surely, we increased. And suddenly we were at like 2,500 and then we were at 3,000. And I remember we had increased up to 2,500 and my weight gain had just stopped, right? It has completely stopped. And I was not doing any kind of movement or anything. And I was just blown away because for me, 2,500 was a lot. I mean, now when I look at it, 2,500 is like the bare minimum recovery intake. And I tend to say most people need to eat quite a lot more than that. But I was eating 2,500 at that point and my weight gain, boom. I didn't gain any weight. I needed to increase to 3,000 as a bare minimum just to gain a little bit of weight. And I was gaining slowly at this point. Even my psychologist told me, like, should you maybe increase it a little bit more? Should we do like 3,500? Because, it's going kind of slowly here. And in retrospect, I should have done that, but I didn't because I was so scared. But now, if I were to coach my past self, I would have pushed more on that. My psychologist didn't push too much on that, but now I'm thinking I should have pushed. And I just remember being so blown away because here I was eating 3,000 calories just to gain the bare minimum weight that I had to gain. That was 3 times the amount that I needed to gain in the beginning. 3 times the amount. And that's how I started loving science. Because I took a leap of faith, I trusted the science, and it worked out. And it was a relief. My frustration was that the science, I actually had to find that on my own because my psychologist, even though she was an amazing psychologist, didn't really talk that much about that. And this is also why I now believe that psychoeducation and telling people in recovery these things is very helpful for them. And I wish someone would have told me. I mean, I had people, I had to go online and really research this. And at that point, there weren't that many people talking about these things. There were like a few people online talking about it, but I wish that it was more of it now, that you can go and listen to a podcast or just click on hashtag and you get a bunch of content up about the topic, right? Anyhow, what happened there? How did I go from eating next to nothing to actually maintaining? And when I say maintaining, that was not because I was at my set point weight. I was actually just reaching a state where my metabolism was sped up so much that I needed to eat more. So don't confuse the metabolic speed up with, oh, I'm at my set point weight right now, because that's not necessarily the case. So how did this happen? Well, what happened was that my metabolism recovered. And When I talk about metabolic healing, a lot of people really want me to give some kind of magical solution in terms of, oh yeah, drink this tea, eat this, don't eat that, but that's not really the case. So for metabolic healing, the key components is food. And when I say food, I specifically mean more calories. You can, if you eat large amounts, but it's just low calorie foods, then you're not really going to get the metabolic healing because your body needs the calories, right? And especially it needs the carbohydrates, also the fats, because I see sometimes a lot of people, this is not for everyone, but a lot of people in recovery, they tend to like, oh yeah, I'll eat more calories, but I'll eat a bunch of protein and no carbohydrates, right? A lot of these hormones that regulates, weight, metabolism, etc., such as, for instance, leptin, are actually quite dependent on carbohydrates to function normally. So food is necessary, and also rest. A lot of people are like, oh yeah, but I am eating 3,000 calories. I'm eating so much, but I don't feel like I'm progressing with my recovery. My weight has kind of stalled out, or I'm feeling quite disordered and rigid about whatsoever. And then they are exercising. And I have done an episode about exercise and eating disorder recovery prior. I do recommend checking that one out if you are interested in learning a bit more about exercise, movement. Because the thing with exercise and recovery, very often it can kind of camouflage itself as not being exercise. So it'll be like constantly moving around. You may not go to the gym, but you're like, oh yeah, let me redecorate my house and then go for a very long power walk. And sometimes those treating eating disorders aren't able to identify that, right? They might be like, oh yeah, you can't go to the gym, but a walk is fine, Like you could walk for maximum 30 minutes per day. And that walk becomes like the most power walk, rigid, obsessive thing. And it's like, you can't walk 28 minutes, you need to walk exactly 30 minutes, right? Can you see how it creeps in? Or it is like, oh yeah, you can't do exercise, but you can do some yoga. And then it becomes this intensive cardio yoga, like hot yoga in a studio, absolutely, dying, And it's like, be mindful of the movement, okay? Because you might feel like, yeah, you're only tricking yourself, you're not really, feel like you're tricking your treatment professionals into kind of agreeing to you doing movement, but you're the one who suffers the consequences, right? So you think you're tricking them, maybe you are, but you are essentially tricking yourself. And you are the one who's going to end up with not getting the results of recovery that you wanted. So those are the key factors to metabolic healing: rest and food. And there is this thing like, oh yeah, but doesn't exercise improve your metabolism? Yeah, I mean, that depends, that really does depend. Because if your energy is suppressed, then the exercise is taking the energy and using the energy for exercise, then you're not really getting enough energy in to speed up your metabolism. It's kind of like, oh yeah, but I'm saving so much money. I mean, I'm spending it all on clothes, but I am saving money, but I am spending it on clothes. Why don't I have more money? Because you're using it the same way. Your metabolism is not healing if you're wasting all the calories that should go to metabolic healing on movement. And then a lot of people are like, well, yeah, but what if I just eat enough to, to make up for the exercise calories? And then I'm saying, yeah, but why are you exercising then? You know it's not the best thing to do for you if you know your body needs rest. Recovery is about doing what feels wrong, which includes resting when you don't feel like resting. Are you really doing something that's good for your recovery by going to the gym when you know that you probably shouldn't? And also, I think I mentioned this in the exercise podcast episode. When you are recovering, your muscles is often already broken down, right? And you will actually gain muscles as well by resting. Not all the weight you gain is body fat, even though that is an essential and important part of weight gain. You are also gaining muscle tissue, right? If you've lost muscle tissue from your eating disorder, which is very common. So, can you recover on a lower amount? I mean, you can weight restore on a lower amount, or you can weight restore being in a binge restrict cycle. But it's kind of like, why? Why wouldn't you recover also your metabolism and get all the benefits of recovery? So a metaphor that I've used before when it comes to metabolic healing is that of budgeting, right? Imagine if someone gave me like $50 or something to live on for a week. Would I make it? I mean, yeah, probably. I'd probably have to turn off my electricity, buy the cheapest food I could find, wouldn't have money for things such as, hair products, doing my nails, all of those nice little things that I normally would do. And then if you gave me a lot more money, if you gave me like a decent amount of money, then I would have money to turn on my heating and not freeze. I would have money to go to the hairdresser, get my nails done, buy myself nice food. I would have money not just to survive, but to thrive. Think of it as if you have a country and you do budget cuts, the schools are still going to stay open, but they're going to be quite run down because there's not money to, to fix the mold in the wall or to, give the students a decent lunch. And, the roads are still going to be open, but there's not going to be any money to renovate and fix them. So they're going to be quite, in bad shape, right? Going to be holes in the roads, right? And the same thing goes with your body and your mind in recovery. If you're eating just enough to gain weight, you might still notice that some of the physical and mental symptoms of an eating disorder haven't passed yet. For instance, if you're someone that menstruates and have lost your period due to the eating disorder, you may notice that your period is not coming back. And I do want to say that some people might get their period back regardless, because for some people, that is a high priority for the body. And this is one thing that I say a lot. Our bodies have different priorities. Some people notice that their body highly prioritizes, hormones, and other people notice that their body highly prioritizes like hair growth and nail growth. It really depends, right? Yeah, back to what I said. If you're eating just enough to gain weight, because your body will prioritize that, because it's such a huge priority for the body, it's going to prioritize it. But you might notice that your skin kind of feels quite dry and your hair is it's still like falling out, not looking too good. Your nails are just kind of breaking, you're still quite cold, feel kind of off, you feel kind of just not feeling great. And you notice that the mental symptoms of an eating disorder haven't really lessened. You're still noticing that you feel quite rigid, body image hasn't really improved. This is something very fascinating. What I see is that actually in recovery with eating more, body image, even though it might get worse before better, it actually gets better with refeeding. I cannot quite explain why, but there is quite a lot of science that shows a link between undernourishment and body dysmorphia. Check out the Minnesota starvation study by Ansel Keys, just for a bit more information. He was one of the early people who identified this connection, which is very, very fascinating. Again, worse before better. Worse before better. Body image tends to get worse in recovery, and then it gets better with, persistent recovery and refeeding. But if you give your body more energy, it has energy to do all the luxury things, such as growing out your nails, keeping you warm, keeping your hair healthy, making you feel mentally less rigid. And also, as is the key topic of this episode, if you give your body more energy, it has energy to finally speed up your metabolism. So essentially, what happens in famine mode, some call it starvation mode, I call it famine mode. It's a little bit of a misunderstood concept. It is not possible to come to a point where you eat absolutely nothing and you don't lose weight. That's not possible. But it is 100% possible for people to come to a point where they're eating very, very little and their weight is either stable or they might actually be gaining weight. So the idea that starvation mode is just something that completely stops weight gain, it makes it physically impossible to lose weight despite not eating, that's not possible. That's not how it works, right? But it heavily slows down your metabolism. So when I talk about starvation mode or famine mode or saving mode, I use a lot of different words. I refer to the state of metabolic suppression due to famine, or your body registering famine. Whether that is an eating disorder or a diet, or it could even be that you end up eating too little for reasons that may not be intentional, right? What happens is that your body is trying to keep you alive, so it turns down the electricity a little bit, right? Think of it the same way that I said with the budgeting metaphor, right? If I'm going to save money, I'll probably start with turning down my heating a bit, because it's friggin' expensive to keep heating, especially now in the winter in London. Oh my god, my heating bill is going to be so high. Yeah, but I'm still keeping it on. because I can, if I was completely broke, I couldn't. But thankfully, I have a job and I have money to keep the heating on, right? Your body detects famine and your body is trying to keep you alive. So it turns down your basal metabolic resting rate. That is essentially the amount of calories that you burn by complete rest. And I want to emphasize that the BMR calculators that you find online are very rarely accurate. So the calorie calculators that you find online, completely inaccurate. If I were to use those in my recovery, I would never recovered. So please don't go there. Don't do that. It's just based on like a random math that some people did. It does not take into account individual differences or the implications of an eating disorder on metabolism. Because the truth is, in recovery, quite a lot of people need a lot of food to gain weight, and a calorie calculator wouldn't really take this into account, right? They need a lot of food to gain weight if they allow their metabolism to repair, of course. So yeah, your body is essentially turning down the amount of calories you burn by complete rest. Some people will notice that they get more sluggish. Essentially, the body's trying to save energy, so their activity reduces, whilst a lot of people with eating disorder notice the complete opposite reaction, where they actually get more hyperactive. I think I spoke about this as well in the exercise episode, a bit about what this is, why this happens. But overall, it also just reduces the amount of calories you burn from things such as movement as well, right? It just overall reduces your calorie burning. And also, in addition to turning down your basal metabolic resting rate, it also turns down on certain functions. Because now your body has very little calories to survive by, so it has to prioritize the most important things. To prioritize keeping your heart beating, right? So luxuries such as growing healthy hair or healthy nails or keeping you warm, these functions get deprioritized. I want to just remind you the things that I said earlier. Everybody with an eating disorder is different. I see some people who are deathly ill, but they have very healthy hair, right? Or people who have perfect nails, but they're still very, very sick, right? So again, our bodies have different priorities. And a lot of people also notice that their digestive system slows down, start getting all sorts of digestive issues, gastroparesis, etc., like their stomach and digestion just really slows down. Also because there's not that much food coming in, so why does the body need to keep that system going? That's just a waste of calories, right? That's such a luxury, keeping the digestive system going. And this also takes some time to speed up in recovery, but it will eventually speed up if it is lowered due to restriction. And the impact of being in famine mode, it really depends on the person. It impacts everyone differently. But these were just some of the things that happens. Other people have different experiences. Some common things that happen to people when they are in, metabolic suppression is, their sleep can be quite off. They might notice an increased food obsession, very, very common. Obsession with food, not necessarily always hunger, but like a food obsession. Some people even experience early fullness, but they're obsessed with food and very interested in food. Not everyone, but a lot of people. Rigidity, mood swings, desire to be alone, hyperactivity or increased tiredness, lack of sex drive, lack of interest in just doing things that aren't related to, food or maybe exercise. Hair might start falling out or thinning. Some people also notice that they get like thin, fine hair growing on their bodies, especially if they are underweight. This is called lanugo, and it's a consequence of, a body being so underweight, undernourished that it tries to keep itself warm by growing these fine little hairs, like a peach fuzz almost. Overall, the consequences of being metabolically suppressed is not very pleasant. But I'd say the most telltale sign someone is metabolically suppressed is that they gain weight very easily despite not really eating that much. So if this is you, then chances are you're metabolically suppressed. If this, metabolic suppression, if this low metabolism actually was something that started with restriction. If you're someone who've never restricted in your life and you suddenly have extremely slow metabolism, it could be worth checking things such as like your thyroid. But you're listening to this podcast, so just a wild guess, you may have been involved in some form of restriction, because it's been almost 30 minutes of this episode and you're still listening. Maybe? But of course, certain things in your body might slow down as a result of restriction, and that might also be, visible to a doctor. But it's important to be aware of what is caused by the restriction and what is caused by other issues, right? So for instance, your doctor might be like, oh yeah, you have a very slow digestive system. But it's very important to be aware if that slow digestive system is a result of your eating disorder or not, right? Very often it is. And unfortunately, a lot of time people kind of forget about this and or ignore it. I don't know. I think it's a mix. And then they start thinking, I need to heal my gut. I need to heal my metabolism, but I'm not going to actually eat more. I'm going to drink this tea or do this weird, regime that is just going to make things worse. If the root cause is restriction, then the solution is to eat more. I know that's so logical, but when you are energy suppressed and deep into an eating disorder, that can just seem like impossible. The unicorn syndrome, do not underestimate the power of the unicorn syndrome is in this situation, okay? It is about taking a leap of faith. And that's what I did, even though I didn't feel like it. I didn't want it. I did not want it. And I say this so many times because very often people are like, yeah, but how do I want to do it? I don't want to do it. So I need to wait until I want to do it. That's not really going to happen. You're never going to want to do it. I mean, maybe some have that experience, but working with people eating disorders, that's quite rare. There might be moments where people feel ready, like, okay, now I feel ready to take a leap of faith. I feel ready to take a jump. But it's very rare, like, yay, I'm so much looking forward to, this and that. I mean, short burst of motivation might come, but overall, there is the importance of doing what feels wrong until it feels right, because it will eventually, if you keep doing it. But if you only do it once and you're just like, oh yeah, this felt wrong, let's not do it again, you're not really going to get anywhere, right? You need to repeat it. Repeatedly do it. Repeat. Of course, there's more to recovery than repeating what feels wrong, but it is a key part of it that you can't really get past. You can do all the healing and trauma work that you want, but if you're not really challenging what feels wrong and challenging your fears, there is a limit to how far you're going to go. If someone is terrified of dogs, they can do all the reading about dogs they want. They can do all the healing and trauma work about that time where they were bit by a dog when they were 10. But eventually they need to go to the dog park, face dogs, and have experiences with dogs and kind of prove to their brain that the danger signals that you send out is actually unnecessary. There is no threat. Because that's the thing with an eating disorder. It's your brain wrongly interpreting the safe thing, which is, of course, recovery, as a threat, as a danger. So, long story short, if you are someone who is struggling with restriction-induced metabolic suppression, aka your eating disorder has kind of messed up your metabolism, you need to increase your intake and you need to rest. It is simple, but it's not easy. It's simple because it's pretty straightforward, but it's not easy because your eating disorder is going to come with all sorts of reasons why you can't do it. I wouldn't believe the different reasons that I've heard from people with eating disorders as to why they can't increase their intake. And I always say, if you can, get a dietitian with eating disorder experience. Not a dietitian that is, invested in diet culture and doesn't know these things and treat your metabolic suppression as, just you have a genetically low metabolism, rather than this is a suppressed metabolism that we need food to increase. Because yeah, we all have individual metabolism. Some people have naturally a higher or lower metabolism. That's just a normal part of being a human being, right? But we do know that restriction decreases the metabolism. Also in people without eating disorders. People who go on diets, the diet decreases the metabolism. That's also why you see most people who go on a diet, something like 95%, they actually very quickly gain the weight back, very often with a little bit of a bonus weight gain as well. Because your body is like, oh yeah, that was a famine. That was kind of rough. We should save up a little bit extra body fat just for the next episode, right? And this is why you see people who are weight restoring being in a binge restrict cycle. They will tend to be like, oh yeah, but why isn't, I'm eating more, but why am I not stabilizing at my healthy set point weight range? Why is my weight not stabilizing? Why am I still yo-yoing up and down in weight? And it's because your metabolism is still detecting famine, Yeah, you might have a binge day where you eat a high amount, but you also have restriction the next day or a few days later. Or you might be restricting the whole day and then eat at night. Your body is still going to detect famine. So the key is not necessarily just getting in more calories, but also getting in more calories regularly. Have regular meals. Don't fall into the trap of saving up your calories for night. It is a disordered pattern. Yes, it is okay if you're someone who naturally, you just kind of enjoy having a bigger dinner. That's fine. Be mindful of the pattern of saving up calories, And I know this can be difficult because if you are someone who is in a binge restrict pattern where you're kind of eating a high amount at night, you might wake up and not be hungry, but you still need to eat. That's the key thing. Still need to eat. In terms of how many calories should I eat, that really does depend, and I cannot prescribe you an exact calorie intake because I'm not a dietitian and I'm not your dietitian, I'm not your doctor. And this is why I tend to recommend, if you can, work with an eating disorder dietitian that's specialized in this and has worked with people with eating disorder before. Ideally, someone who is informed about, health at every size, anti-diet, intuitive eating, all of these things. And even better if they have some experience, working, maybe in inpatient. And the reason why I say that to people who have experience working with inpatient eating disorder clients is that they tend to have a better understanding of hypermetabolism, which takes me to my next point, which I will have to very quickly recap because this episode is getting long. When you are increasing your intake, you might come to a point where your metabolism goes from being very, very low and then it, boom, goes super high and you need to eat a lot of food just to gain weight. I've spoken to people who've been eating 4, 5, 6,000 calories and barely gain any weight because the metabolism has just gone into overdrive. And this tends to happen more frequently to people who are inpatient. Why? Is it the hospital walls having some magical power? No, it is because this group is very often, they don't have any choice but to follow their calorie prescription, right? They can't just be like, oh yeah, I don't really feel like eating it, right? They kind of have to eat it. They have to increase their intake. Not always, because there are some clinics that are kind of, I would say underfeeding their patients. But for those clinics who are not underfeeding their patient will come in. And for instance, I'm talking from someone whose sister is an eating disorder specialist. She worked at an inpatient clinic in my home country of Norway. And there she said 3,000 calories. That was the intake. And of course, sometimes needs to go above it as well. And when you're kind of forced to eat 3,000 calories, then your metabolism is kind of forced to increase, right? But if you are outpatient, then it's higher chance that you are kind of not eating the calories that you need, right? Not because of the walls, but just because it's easier to restrict when you don't have anyone supervising you. So do yourself a favor and supervise yourself. Make sure that you are eating enough. When it comes to hypermetabolism, I think just because of this episode getting a bit long, I think I may need to do a separate episode just on hypermetabolism. Also just on increased metabolism in general, because this is something that happens so often with my clients. Start working together, they're metabolically suppressed, and then we keep working together, and then their metabolism just boom, right? And they're like, I am eating so much food. What is going on? Why am I like either not gaining weight or gaining weight very, very slowly? And I think when you're metabolically suppressed, that can just seem like such a luxurious problem to have. But I can reassure you that for those of my clients who are in that stage of hypermetabolism or just very increased metabolism, having to force feed themselves, it is a job. It is not always so pleasant. It's better than being metabolically suppressed, of course, but it's an interesting process, right? And yeah, very often we need to focus more on like structural, almost mechanical eating in those stages. I definitely had a similar experience, when I was eating my 3,000 and I was quite full, and I remember force feeding myself. And I'm so glad I did it, because that of course meant that my metabolism actually did heal. And even after recovery, when I started eating intuitively, even though I didn't count calories, I did notice that I was eating quite a decent amount. Body asked for quite a decent amount, and I was maintaining my set point with intuitive eating, no restriction, and eating quite a high amount. Again, not counting, but I could just see that I was having big portions of food, right? And this takes me to another point that's very important to say. That is that metabolism, for those recovering from eating disorder, the metabolism actually tends to be slightly elevated for a few months after recovery. So if you are someone who is, maybe you are fresh out of recovery and you notice that, well, why am I still so hungry? Or why do I still need to eat so much just not to lose a bunch of weight? Why do I need to still push it a bit with food? It is because that metabolic, that slightly hypermetabolic state, or even I can say hypermetabolism light, just elevation of metabolism is very, very common. I posted a graph about this on Let's Recover a few weeks ago, I think. Could it be a bit longer than that? I don't know, where I show the graph essentially showing more about metabolic recovery and eating disorders, and how post-recovery increased metabolism is quite common. It essentially shows the graph for someone with an eating disorder, how the metabolism is lower in the beginning and then it gets really higher and it stays kind of elevated. And even though the post-recovery hyper or like increased metabolism post-recovery, which can be quite high, even though that tends to normalize, I do see that a lot of people with eating disorder, and again, this is me based on my observations rather than me having a specific paper on it, I have observed that people who go for recovery and eat a sufficient intake, they do tend to have a good metabolism, kind of forever, right? If they are not restricting. I think this is because a lot of people without eating disorders, they're kind of like dieting a bit here and there, and they're kind of not really making sure to take care of themselves that way. They kind of yo-yo diets. That's a very common thing to do. And as a result of just going on a crash diet now and then, their metabolism have kind of gone down a bit, right? But a person with an eating disorder knows that dieting is not something they can engage in, so they are just constantly sufficiently eating. And as a result, their metabolism just naturally stabilizes at quite a safe and decent amount, right? And I think this is why you very often see that someone with an eating disorder might need more food than those around them for not just after recovery, but just for quite a time, because they are metabolically healthy, and a lot of other people who have been constantly dieting, they aren't. So another thing that I very often get asked about this topic is, does this only apply to anorexia nervosa, and does it only apply to people who are very underweight? And the answer is no. It applies to anyone who's metabolically suppressed. It doesn't necessarily mean that you are underweight. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have anorexia. It is the same for other eating disorders, and also just for disordered eating in general, just any kind of eating that takes you to a, nutritionally induced metabolic suppression, right? So basically it's induced by the fact that you have not eaten sufficient calories to keep your metabolism going. It's the case for bulimia as well. People often think that when I talk about this podcast, it's only anorexia, but I talk about all eating disorders that involve some form of restriction. And bulimia is a restrictive eating disorder, and binge eating disorder in some cases is also a restrictive eating disorder if it has strong elements of restriction that drives the binging. I just call it a binge restrict cycle. I think that binge eating disorder is a little bit misunderstood in general. I think there are kind of two distinct groups of binge eating disorder, restrictive type and the non-restrictive type. And for either types, restriction is obviously not the solution. This episode is getting long, and I realize that I have so many other things I could add, but again, it is a long episode, so I can't add everything. But just as a short recap, your metabolism is not ruined. You can heal it. Your body has metabolically adapted to restriction because it's trying to keep you alive. Imagine if it didn't do that. Imagine if your metabolism was just staying healthy in famine. You would be dead. You would be dead. This is literally how us human beings have survived periods of starvation. It's because our bodies have adjusted, slowing down everything, go into saving mode, and then make sure to, prioritize weight gain once food is available, and then it normalizes, right? Problem with eating disorders is that very often you stay in a constant, famine state. You don't allow your body to actually normalize. Your body has built-in mechanisms to control this. You don't need to think of controlling your weight or controlling your food. Your body is doing the job if you let it. Take leptin, for example. Leptin is a hormone that controls, hunger, appetite, and it also controls weight gain and weight storing, more specifically fat storage. Restriction lowers leptin, and a lower body fat percentage also lowers leptin. So you might be normal weight, but you have very little body fat. You're just muscles. You're also going to have quite low leptin levels. And if you have low leptin levels, then your body is going to respond by prioritizing fat gain and also by making you eat. With recovery, if you are, actually going all in and letting your body, restore metabolism, the leptin levels tend to normalize prematurely, meaning that your leptin levels will go up before you are weight restored and before you are fully renourished, right? So it'll signal to you, you're fine now, when you're not. I think I spoke about this in the episode about weight gain and set point weight. It's just something to be aware of, that sometimes you might notice that your metabolism, or like parts of your metabolism, such as your leptin levels, might recover a bit sooner than you, right? I don't know the logic behind it. It's a little bit unfortunate. It's just something to be aware of, right? Which is why often you need to force feed yourself a bit in recovery and actually push up the weight gain. That's kind of what I said, again, what I said a little bit earlier in this episode. When I work with clients, they very often come to the point where their metabolism is high and their appetite has gone down and their weight gain, if they need to gain weight, has stopped and they need to push it. And they're just like, oh my God, what a difference from where I used to be. And also, when you are metabolically suppressed, some people experience extreme hunger. They just get this relentless drive to eat. This is also a very typical thing with undernourishment. Some people notice that their appetite get kind of turned off, and other people notice the exact opposite. And other people notice a constant fluctuation between the two, right? So if you are experiencing extreme hunger, that could be a very clear sign that you need to eat more. Check out my episode on extreme hunger if you haven't already. And I've also done some episode about, mental hunger, food obsession, the fear of, oh my God, am I emotionally eating? I've done episodes on that, so do check that out because it talks about it more in depth. But overall, extreme hunger, binge eating, quote unquote binge eating, reactive hunger as I call it, as a result to undernourishment, that's also something that heals with metabolic healing. If you are also getting out of the undernourishment stage, right? That's good news if you're someone who started struggling with binge eating after restriction. Actually, completely letting go of the restriction, completely letting go of it mentally and physically, is the key step towards healing binge eating that is restriction induced. Okay guys, let me take a listener question, and I'm gonna have to try and answer this quickly because this is the longest episode I've ever done. Oh my God, this is so long. Do let me know if you guys enjoy the longer episodes or if you feel like it's a little bit too much. I would love to hear, so feel free to DM me, letting me know if you prefer longer or shorter, or if you don't mind either. Anyhow, this listener question ties in a little bit to the topic. And the question goes, why is all the weight I've gained in recovery gone to my stomach? And will it distribute? I will do an episode answering this more in depth, but I will do a very quick answer for it now. And the answer is, when your body is in, famine mode, you're undernourished, potentially underweight, your body will prioritize fat gain in the most important areas. Where do you think the most important areas? It's where your organs are. It's in your abdominal area. It's very, very common that when you are someone starting recovery, you may notice that most of your weight gain in the beginning tends to go to that area. And then you add in bloating and slowed gastric emptying, aka just your stomach going kind of slow, your digestive system going kind of slow. You might be constipated. So basically food is in the stomach and system longer. And no wonder why it seems like you've gained all the weight on your stomach. So some of it is just body fat prioritizing that your body prioritizing gaining fat in the most important area first, but also the bloating and slowed gastric emptying. Potentially water retention as well. Water retention for some reason just loves staying in the abdominal area. At least in some people, they notice that water retention, it just enjoys the stomach area, right? Will it redistribute? Yes, it will. If, important, if you're not restricting. If you're in a cycle of constant binge restrict, then you're not really signalizing to your body that it's okay and safe to gain weights all over my body and to spread out the fat. You don't need to hold on to stomach fat because stomach fat is the most important, most important area. You don't need to hold on to it. You can let it spread out now. It's okay. Kind of like when I said the metaphor with calories and money, your body's realizing that it can afford to spread out the weight rather than holding on for the most important area, right? Trust the process. Trust that it will even out with time. But also be a little bit aware that body dysmorphia may also play a role here. Some people are like, oh my God, my stomach is so big. And it's not. So that also adds a layer, but it's not all in your head. There is some priority for the body to gain weight in the abdominal area first. You have to trust the process, give your body time, give it fuel, and it will even out. And as I mentioned, I will do an episode about weight gain and, uneven weight gain later. Okay, guys, almost 50 minutes. Oh my God. I hope you enjoyed this episode. And I look forward to, I'm talking with myself, but I look forward to publishing another episode next week.